Okay, imagine you are working on an oil rig in the middle of a quiet lake. The water around you is only a few meters deep, and then your drill suddenly gets stuck. You try to pull it free, but the entire platform begins to lean. At first, only a little, then more. So you leave the rig, get into a boat, and head for the shore. And from there, you watch something that should be impossible. A huge drilling platform rolls over and disappears beneath a lake that is not even deep enough to hide it. Then the water begins to spin. Barges start moving by themselves. Trees near the shore begin falling into the lake, and slowly everyone realizes what is happening. The lake is not flooding, it is draining. So, where is all that water going? This happened on November 20th, 1980, at Lake Peigneur in southern Louisiana near the city of New Iberia. Now, before that morning, it was a shallow freshwater lake, a quiet place where people went fishing. Nothing about it looked unusual. But the really important part of Lake Peigneur was not what people could see. It was what was hidden underneath it. Deep below the lake was a giant underground mountain of salt. And inside that salt was a working mine. Now, when I say mine, do not imagine one small tunnel. This place had huge rooms wide enough for vehicles to drive through. The ceilings were supported by massive pillars of salt. And that morning, around 50 miners were working more than 1,000 feet below the surface. So you had two completely different jobs happening at the same time. Above the lake, one crew was drilling down, looking for oil. Below the lake, another crew was digging through the salt. They were supposed to stay far away from each other. Well, something obviously went wrong. The drilling crew had already gone more than 1,000 feet into the ground when the drill became stuck. They tried to pull it free. It would not move. Then the platform began to tilt. The 7 men on the rig did not know exactly what was happening, but they understood one thing very quickly. Staying there was a bad idea. So they abandoned the platform and reached the shore. Not long after that, the whole rig disappeared, and beneath them, inside the mine, water had started arriving. At first, the miners heard a strange roar. Then muddy water began moving through the tunnels. Imagine being that far underground and suddenly seeing water coming toward you. You cannot climb out through a window or something. You cannot simply run outside, There was one way back to the surface, and the lift had to make the trip after trip. The evacuation alarm was raised. Workers began moving toward the exit. Some were deep inside remote parts of the mine, so other miners drove through the tunnels to warn them. And while the water kept coming in, the lift kept traveling down, picking up more people and bringing them back to the surface. Somehow, every miner made it out. But why was the water moving so quickly? Well, this is where the whole accident became much worse. The drill had apparently created a path between the lake and the salt mine below. And fresh water does something very simple to salt. It dissolves it. You know what happens when you put salt into a glass of water? It slowly disappears. The same thing was now happening underground, just on a massive scale. Water entered through the opening. It dissolved more salt. That made the opening larger. A larger opening allowed more water inside, and that water dissolved even more salt. So the accident was feeding itself. The mine was not just filling with water, the water was building a bigger drain as it went. Parts of the underground rooms began collapsing, and up on the surface, the whirlpool kept growing. It pulled in the drilling rig. Then supply barges began moving toward it. One after another, 11 barges disappeared. A tugboat was pulled in. Trees went down. Sections of the shoreline simply broke away and vanished. One fisherman and his nephew, who had been out on the lake, managed to race their small boat to shore before the current became too strong. From safety, they watched the lake tear apart the land around them. And the strangest part was still coming. Lake Peigneur was connected to the Gulf of Mexico by the Delcambre Canal. Normally, water flowed out of the lake through that canal, but now the lake was emptying into the ground. Its water level dropped so far that the canal began doing something a canal is not supposed to do. It reversed direction. Water from the Gulf began flowing backward toward the lake. And where that water reached the newly collapsed lake bed, it fell into the crater as a huge waterfall. For a short time, flat Louisiana had a waterfall around 150 feet high. That is roughly the height of a 15-story building. So now the lake was being emptied from below, while salt water from the Gulf was pouring in from the side. Air trapped inside the floating mine had nowhere to go. It was forced up through old mine shafts carrying water and mud high into the air. The entire place had changed from a quiet lake into something that looked almost unreal. Over the next few hours, the old lake was gone. But then, slowly, water from the Gulf began filling the giant hole again. And a few days later, something almost funny happened. Some of the barges that had disappeared into the whirlpool began coming back up. 9 of the 11 eventually returned to the surface, almost like toys popping up in a bathtub. The drilling rig did not come back. Neither did the salt mine. It was completely flooded and could no longer be used. When the water finally became calm again, Lake Peigneur was still there, but it was not the same lake. Before the accident, it had been shallow and filled with fresh water. Afterward, parts of it were around 200 feet deep. Salt water had entered from the Gulf. The shape of the lake had changed. The life inside it changed. And an underground mine had become part of the lake itself. And all of that happened because of one connection that should never have existed. Now, you may be wondering, how could somebody drill directly into a mine? And honestly, that question was never answered completely. You will often hear that someone used the wrong map, the wrong coordinates, or measured the drilling location incorrectly. And something like that may have happened, but the physical evidence disappeared into the flooded mine. The official investigation could explain how the lake drained, but it could not prove every detail of the original mistake. The best evidence was literally washed away. And somehow, despite a drilling rig disappearing, an underground mine flooding, 11 barges being swallowed, and a canal flowing backward, no person was killed. The rig crew left before the platform went down. The miners followed their emergency procedures and reached the surface. They were lucky, but they were also fast. A few more minutes underground, and this very strange engineering accident could have become a much darker story. You know, most disasters leave wreckage in one place. A broken bridge, a crashed aircraft, a burned building, This disaster changed the map. A lake became a drain. A canal flowed backward. A waterfall appeared where no waterfall had ever existed. And when it was all over, the lake came back as a completely different lake. The first opening may have been small, but it connected 3 things that should never have met: fresh water above, a salt mine below, and enough empty space underground to hold an entire lake. Once those three things came together, the disaster no longer needed help. It began making itself bigger. So, if you want to keep exploring stories where ordinary work suddenly turns into something nobody believed was possible, subscribe to Failure Atlas. And now you choose where we go next. Which failure should we put on the map?